Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, Jesse Collings, and joining me today, first-time guest on the show, it's Case Lowe. Case, of course, is the host of the Open the Voice podcast, right here on the VOW Podcast Network, covering Dragon Gate, pretty much more in depth than anyone else. Do you get tired of that intro, Case, or do you get tired of people saying like, you guys cover Dragon Gate better than everyone else? You ever get tired of people heaping that praise onto you?
No, I'd get pissed off if somebody was covering it better than me. At this point, I have a lane. I'm very happy to stick in that lane, and I don't anticipate anybody, at least in the immediate future. I'm open to all of the Dragon Gate discourse imaginable. Trust me, I wish more people talked about it, but I do plan on still being the premier podcaster and writer for said promotion for a very long time.
Yeah, I would say like you're like top 5.
it's Dave Meltzer, who's always right. It's my partner Mike Spears. It's Alan Forel. It's I as long as I can be mentioned alongside those guys, I'm good.
Yeah, like top 5, top 10. But anyway, the reason I had you on is because we'll get to that in a second. But I want to kind of do the introduction because the title of this podcast is just where is wrestling headed? Where is wrestling going? And this is a big boy discussion, Case. This is why I wanted to have this show, because I wanted to be able to tackle subjects like this. And we're not going to be reviewing a show that just happened. We're not going to be fantasy booking anything. I wanted to have kind of like a really fundamental discussion on what is happening right now in pro wrestling. And what is happening right now that is going to influence the pro wrestling product into the future. And the reason I invited you on to talk about this is because I was listening to an episode of your podcast with Mike Spears. And I was listening to it because I was told I was put over on the podcast.
Accurate.
And so I was listening to it. And within the context of talking about something that I had said, which we're not going to get into here, but you and Mike started talking about like the style of pro wrestling, and you brought up how Dragon Gate and the Dragon Gate style has had a profound influence on professional wrestling today. That's very obvious if you watch kind of any tag team wrestling, specifically in the United States. Obviously, the Dragon Gate style has a very important impact on the Young Bucks, who then themselves have a very important impact on indie wrestling and tag team wrestling, and certainly like the multi-man matches you see almost every week on AEW Dynamite. It's all are influenced by Dragon Gate and the Dragon Gate style. And you kind of talked about how that's like kind of 20 years ago, right? Dragon Gate USA starts. When did Dragon Gate USA start? Like, would you say that? It's like probably like 15 years ago now, right?
Yeah, it was July of 2009.
Yeah, so 14 years ago. Dragon Gate USA starts, and there's and even before that, right, you have like the Do Fixer versus Blood Generation match in Ring of Honor. That's a few years before that, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that's 2006, and that's what really kicks off, I guess, the idea of the Dragon Gate style, as anybody listening to this podcast would know it.
Right, that was that WrestleMania week? No, that wasn't a WrestleMania weekend show.
No, it was. It was the first.
Right.
It was the first Supercard of Honor, and Gabe brought those guys over. That was the same weekend as Bryan Danielson versus Lance Storm and Bryan Danielson versus Roderick Strong in a 56-minute match. And it was, already a weekend in which more eyeballs were on Ring of Honor than arguably ever before. And then with the Blood Generation versus Do Fixer match, and this will be a later discussion we could get into, but because Dave Meltzer liked it so much, a lot of eyeballs went on it, and it changed the entire way that Ring of Honor did business going forward. And that all starts in 2006.
Right, and it has it's really interesting when someone's talking to me about that match. I remember this was a couple of years ago, but it was like this discussion was matches that were great or matches that have aged poorly. And when you often think about matches that have aged poorly, you're going to go further back in time to maybe something like Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, which if you were to watch that without knowing really any of the circumstances surrounding it, you'd be like, this match is bad. Like fundamentally, it is a bad match. But in its time and place, it was perfect. You wouldn't really think about like that match as being a match that aged bad. If you watch that match today, you're like, damn, this is still great. But the argument that someone said was that the reason that match got over so big was because no one had ever seen anything really like that in the United States before. And now that has become so common, it doesn't stand out as much. So I don't necessarily agree that the match is aged poorly, but it's an interesting philosophical idea, which is this match was so transcendent at the time, but because it was so influential and the style that they did would end up becoming so influential, the match doesn't feel the same 20 years later, if you were to watch it today. But
that's an interesting talking point, real quick, just because I still think, and look, I know I'm saying this as the guy that does the Dragon Gate podcast, and sometimes it makes me a little uncomfortable when I'm in other settings to put over the promotion as strongly as I do sometimes, because it makes me come across like a cheerleader, not an analyst. But I want to make it clear for anybody that maybe doesn't listen to Open the Voice Gate that I'm incredibly harsh on Dragon Gate when the time comes, when I need to be. It's not a fan podcast. It's critical analysis. But any six-man tag that you watch in modern wrestling, it's still missing the component that Do Fixer versus Blood Generation had, or Muscle Outlaws versus Typhoon, or even in more recent years, like a Masquerade versus RED. There's a level of polish that happens in Dragon Gate wrestling that the Young Bucks might have and Kenny Omega might have, but the run-of-the-mill standard six-man tag, even if it's emulating what they did, they are not replicating the full ideology of what they did. So I will push back on that notion, but I do think that's an interesting argument.
right, yeah, and it just exists kind of to kind of position it in respects to how influential that match was. And but when we talk about Dragon Gate, we talk about that was 20 years ago almost at this point. And so what it begs the question of what is happening now, right now in pro wrestling, that we're going to look at in 15, 20 years and say, wow, that was really the first time we saw that, and now that is everywhere. What wrestlers are out there that we think are going to be the prototypes for a future generation of wrestlers? And what is happening at every level of wrestling? What's happening in Japan? What's happening on the US Indies? What's happening in AEW? What's happening in WWE? And how are those things, what do we think those things are going to do to influence the future? And I'll start with this point, a very basic point that we can kind of start the discussion with. And that is, I think we're reaching a point where just going out and doing cool moves is not really going to help you get over at all anymore. And, old crusty people will say that was, oh, you can't just go out and do moves. That never worked. But that's not true, because there are plenty of people that go out there and have had made incredible careers basically on going out and doing cool shit in the ring. And I think like if you go back and you watch like early Ring of Honor or US indie wrestling in the early 2000s, guys that come out, guys like Amazing Red, or if you go to watch like early Pac, guys go out there and they just have this incredible athleticism and coordination. They do cool moves that no one had seen before, and the people just lose their minds. And they lose their minds in a way that I'm envious of. I'm envious of how cool it was to see a guy do a Phoenix Splash, how cool it was for a guy to do a crazy dive to the outside. And I feel like in recent years, especially because AEW has guys doing crazy moves all the time, that unless someone truly, truly special, like I think El Hijo del Vikingo is coming along and just doing this absolutely outrageous, innovative, never before seen stuff before, I think we're kind of reached a point where if you just come out and you do like a 630 senton and you do like a crazy Canadian destroyer, yeah, people will clap, people will pop for it, but it doesn't have the same kind of, amazement that the audiences of the past had. And I think wrestling is kind of shifting away from I don't want to say it's not embracing those kinds of, spot heavy, cool move guys, but I think fans are kind of shifting to demanding a lot more.
It's diminishing returns with, as flashy as your biggest high spot is, the reaction is lesser than it was 5 years ago doing that same move.
Yeah, and it just, even if it's like someone new that's coming on, like I feel like there's a huge difference between like, Sammy Guevara on the first episode of AEW Dynamite, doing a 630 senton or doing a big dive through a table, and people being like, "Oh my god, yeah," and chanting "Holy shit" and being really into it. And now it's like people would be into those spots, but it's just not at the same level, because I think AEW specifically, every week someone is doing something like that, and people are seeing that on national television. So guys in the indies that might be doing the same thing are not as mind blowing. Certainly not as they were, in the early 2000s, when nobody in WWE was doing that. And, TNA was a smaller thing, and there weren't as many people in TNA that were doing that. But you go out and you were to watch, a Ring of Honor show with one of those really innovative, high flying guys, it's a totally different reaction. To the degree that I'm jealous of. Have you ever seen, there's this really, it made the rounds a couple of years ago. I don't even know what promotion it's from, but there's an indie match with Amazing Red. I think it's probably from like 2000 or 2001, and Amazing Red is like legitimately like 16 years old in it. And he comes out, and like the fans are laughing. They're laughing at this guy.
Yeah.
There's no way this guy could be a wrestler. Look at him. He's like 5'5", 16-year-old, 130 pounds. Like, the announcers are like trying to put him over, but you can tell they're not like really into it. And then he just does like 200 innovative moves, and the crowd that was laughing at him is like marking out. The announcers like don't even know like what he's doing. Like, he's going to the top and he's like rotating a few times, and the announcer's like, he jumps up, he's spinning around. What was that? And it's just like this incredible moment where it's just like, this is someone hitting the scene, being so innovative, and just wrestling in a style that nobody had seen before, and just instantly getting over. And I just don't think that happens anymore, because we're conditioned to expect certain things in wrestling. And I do think that era, which existed for a very long time, is coming to a close. And I'm not sure what is going to replace that.
Yeah, I have a million thoughts, a million different directions we can go there. I think it's certainly not to the level of Amazing Red. It's funny you bring that up, though, because I do think that happened somewhat recently with Galeno Del Mal, who is Dr. Wagner Jr.'s son. So
his
twice
large
removed.
large adult son.
Yeah, his large adult son, who went to GLEAT and then subsequently did WrestleMania weekend on the WrestleCon side of things. And I think people were like, whomst is this man? This 300-pound luchador. Is he just going to be like 911 in ECW and just stand there, and that will be the most of his effectiveness? And then he starts doing cool lucha things that people go, oh, this is incredible. And it wasn't to the degree of Amazing Red, because he's not to the degree of a wrestler that Amazing Red was. But I do still think there's stuff capable here. Your big picture question of where wrestling is going next, I apologize in advance. I'm going to be incredibly pessimistic on this podcast, and I will probably be far too existential even for my liking here. I do think we're at a cultural crisis where we are simply consuming too many things, and I don't know when the cutoff is. It feels like sometime around 2016. Culture as we know it is just going to exist in a vacuum, and it is going to become harder and harder to detect trends going forward, because we know what wrestling in the 1990s looked like, and we know what wrestling in the 2000s looked like. But as we start to remove ourselves from the 2010s, I think that vision is going to become muddy, because what we were consuming from 2011 and the amount of things we were consuming, the amount of things we had available to us compared to the end of the decade in 2019, it was just far too much. I mean, I see a cool move on Twitter every hour, and it means nothing. I'm never going to look at it again. I'm not going to remember that guy's name. I'm not going to remember that guy's promotion. It's just on to the next cool thing that I'm going to see. And we're consuming roughly, I think the stat is, compared to 2003, we consume 2 years of data every 3 days or something like that, if that makes sense, per scale. We're just seeing too much. So I think it's harder to analyze trends going forward, but I do have a general idea of where I think wrestling is going.
Yeah, and I think that's true, like in the sense of like, you follow one GIF account on Twitter, and you're gonna see all sorts of stuff all the time, which is why I almost think like, it's like on the indies, it's almost irrelevant. Like now it's almost like someone has to do that cool stuff in AEW or WWE or maybe New Japan for it to like actually matter.
Yeah,
Because
those are the only places. Maybe Stardom, but there's not another Japanese promotion that really matters right now, and unless it's happening, it's even as divisive as if it happens on Rampage, I don't think it matters. If it happens on Dynamite, I do think it matters. It's that split. It's that hard to make an impact now.
Yeah, and I think if we were to look at like the last 20 years of pro wrestling, and we were to look at just like pop culture in general, okay, where does something new and something exciting, where does that tend to start in culture?
Well, I think everybody has a different jumping on point now. For some people it's TikTok, and for some people it's Twitter, and I will scream until data says otherwise. You cannot overrule the importance of Facebook still. I mean, in my shoot job, I my life is consumed by the Facebook accounts that I deal with. Facebook is still where the most eyeballs are, with TikTok, certainly creeping up on their territory there, but it's not, it's not a network TV show. It's not an MTV. It's not a specific website. We all have a different jumping on point now. We all have a different version of what's cool, and mainstream gen pop coolness has never been more muddied as a result. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but that's kind of where I land with that question.
Right. Our monarch, what you're getting at here is our monoculture is long dead.
Yes.
And because our culture is now so diversified, like you said, identifying trends is going to be way too difficult, because the trends are going to be smaller and less significant, because people's interests are going to be so scattered. What I'm getting at here is, I think, like, whether it's wrestling, whether it's music, whether it's filmmaking, whether it's fashion, whatever kind of art or cultural thing you want to get at, it's going to start at the grassroots level. The innovative music is going to be played at small clubs. The next, best big thing in fashion is going to start in someone's, basement where they're sewing something. In wrestling, especially over the last 20 years in the United States, innovative wrestling is starting on the US independents. And it's starting with young wrestlers who have different creative ideas that have nothing to lose by pursuing some sort of new, bold direction. And post WCW, post ECW, where WWE wasn't really interested in signing a lot of indie talent, and TNA was kind of restricted on how much they wanted to invest in signing indie talent. There were guys who had years and years and years to kind of polish their craft, which is, why the Young Bucks spent so much time on the US independents, or why someone like Kevin Steen or Sami Zayn, El Generico, Samoa Joe, AJ Styles, obviously the latter two spent a lot of time in TNA too, but they had years and years to kind of refine whatever new style they wanted to push in professional wrestling. And they innovated and they did stuff. And a lot of pro wrestling today, the major stuff, even if, those guys are all big stars, but even the ones that aren't them are still kind of in some ways paying tribute to them in their style of wrestling. Even in a place as stodgy as WWE has been, you look at the way most of the WWE roster wrestles, and it's very similar to the way a lot of Ring of Honor wrestlers wrestled, 8 or 9 years ago. The Usos wrestle completely differently than when they first started. The Usos wrestle like the Young Bucks now.
I've been told they're better than the Young Bucks by some people even.
Right, but like, then that's one of the funny things, is like the Usos are like clearly influenced by the Young Bucks.
Yes.
And so if I were to get pessimistic on this, I would say, are the US indies innovating anymore? And are the talent that is interested in innovating getting the time to kind of experiment and refine that innovation? And I would say that they're not. I would say that the talent on the indies is in a situation, because AEW is so aggressive in signing new talent, and WWE is, waxes and wanes on how aggressive they want to be in signing Indian talent. At some points, they've been extremely competitive in trying to sign everyone under the sun. Other times, they've not looked anywhere close to the indie talent. But in general, because WWE and AEW are both so interested in pursuing indie talent, anyone with a smidge of potential is signed up very quickly.
And that is so dangerous. But this is where I struggle when analyzing the modern US scene, because we have to remember that the golden era of indie wrestling existed out of incompetence. You know, WWE was too stubborn, TNA was too stupid, and that's how we have at one time CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, Roderick Strong, Samoa Joe, all, you know, that's why at the same time Gabe and Super Dragon and Quackenbush and even CZW, all of these guys were able to get rich on talent. And it's like you said, we've gone too far in the opposite direction. The pendulum has swung too far, where now one good weekend, and I think about Marco Stunt when I think about this, one good weekend, and you can get a contract from AEW. And I, you know, on one hand, I respect that Tony Khan loves and appreciates good wrestling, but the business instincts that he has, the fight for survival, the arms race of talent, is negatively impacting talent development overall.
Right. If talent is just going to be signed and they're not going to be given a ton of opportunity to break out on their own, they're not going to get a chance to refine any innovative thing that they're doing. Like it's like I always there are plenty of wrestlers that this example can be used, but I always point to Kevin Steen just because he was so obviously talented, both from a promo standpoint and from an in-ring standpoint. And I know he didn't necessarily have the look that WWE really wanted, but he was just so obviously gifted from like the time he was 16. It's ridiculous that he had like 10 to 15 years on the indies where he was just, you know, wrestling in Ring of Honor, wrestling on other indie shows, and like it's like in a completely different universe from today. Like no one would ever, he wouldn't have 2 years on the indies.
No, I think 2008 Kevin Steen, right as he and El Generico are in the thick of it with the Briscoe brothers, I think they're getting signed. And with all due respect to Kevin Steen, who I love, and I'm elated for all of the success that he's had, 2008 Kevin Steen was probably not ready for a national TV contract. Now, you could say, okay, by 2009, 2010, you know, he was not wasting time in Ring of Honor, but he was bigger and better than that promotion. But still, he would have never been able to get to where he's at now without all the time that he spent marinating, for lack of a better word, on the indie scene. And that just doesn't exist now.
Right. Nick Wayne is already signed to AEW.
Yeah.
And he signed like last year when he was like 16 and a half years old. So that kind of tells you where we're at. And what does that mean? And so like what's happening on the US Indies now? And I don't want to paint the US Indies with a broad brush. There's plenty of good stuff that's happening on the US Indies in many different promotions from coast to coast. But in general, the two trends that I've seen on the US Indies over the last few years, the things that are getting popular on there, the first is deathmatch wrestling, and the second is like comedy meme style wrestling. And those largely became popular as a survival tool because all of the talent that was actually good gets signed either by WWE or AEW. So the people that are left are people that neither of those companies would have any interest in, which would be the heavy deathmatch guys, and you know your Effies and your Alley Cats and your, you know, kind of meme comedy, you know, parasocial social media people. And I don't think those are like positive trends for the industry, and I don't know how that's going to be replicated. I mean, sure, you might get some more deathmatch people, although I already think like the era of peak US indie deathmatch wrestling is probably over. I'm not a huge deathmatch fan, so some other people could probably better elaborate on that. But my understanding is that deathmatch probably peaked a couple of years ago. Maybe I'm wrong.
That seems to be my understanding. I don't know. I have one friend who is extremely into GCW, and even the vibe I get from him is that the deathmatch stuff is not the draw that it once was.
Yeah, like I know Nick Gage has really cut, you know, he's slowed down and he's not working nearly as many matches as he once was. And there's been, you know, all sorts of scummy indie drama going on, not just in GCW, but just kind of across indie wrestling, which that's always going to exist. But I think that's right, the deathmatch scene in general. But those are like the two trends when I look at like, okay, what is being innovated on the indie scene? Like, I don't know what else is there. Like, and that makes me concerned because if there's no innovation happening on the indies, what is going to influence, you know, the major promotions if that's not going to happen? It does come down to what is AEW doing that's new and different, And what is WWE doing that's new and different? Because I don't know if the indies have the ability to influence wrestling the way they did, 5 or 6 and certainly years ago.
What do you think from your perspective? What promotion or promotions are the tastemakers right now on the indie? And it's not a trick question. I think the answer is fairly obvious, but what do you think in 2023? What indie or indies are the ones setting the tone for the rest of the, for lack of a better term, mainstream indie scene?
I mean, I would have to probably say GCW, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. I wanted to be sure that we were on the same page before I launch into a
Yeah.
diatribe here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it feels like we're on Gen 2 of the US Indies. There was a Gen 1 which lasted a while, after the collapse of WCW and ECW, and that kind of birthed the interest in alternative wrestling promotions outside of WWE and TNA, which led to, I think, what, like, no one wants to hear. I'm sure no one wants to hear two guys in their 20s act like wax poetically about what wrestling used to be. But your golden age Ring of Honor, your golden age, Chikara, Evolve, PWG, Dragon Gate USA, those were like your kind of Gen 1 indie promotions, and those are basically all gone. The only one that's still around, in its kind of similar form, is PWG. And it seems like, kind of in the wake of kind of those companies going down for various reasons, you had your GCW, your Black Label Pro, your Beyond Wrestling, kind of emerge as kind of a new independent brands that were gaining some sort of traction in the wake of, like, the death of Evolve and Chikara and those promotions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's 3 generations, and this is just more me thinking about this now. I think Gen 2 is post Cruiserweight Classic through the start of the pandemic, where there was co-opting involved and there was money involved with Flow Slam. And it went from, if you want to say the start of the modern indie scene is 2002 with the birth of Ring of Honor, 2002 through 2015, you're doing this artistically. Indie wrestling exists because it's an alternative to what's going on. And you see in 2016 through the early parts of 2020, indie wrestling exists as a way to get signed by WWE. The pathway to Raw and SmackDown is not like a chaotic wrestling in the Northeast or a Northeast wrestling where it's WWE light. It's not a work rate indie, it's a showmanship indie. That changed, and the mindset changed in 2016 with the Cruiserweight Classic. And then now I think we're in this Gen 3 stage, and I have not been shy about this on Open the Voice Gate, because over the last half of last year, a lot of Dragon Gate wrestlers spent time in America. And so we started talking at length on the podcast about the US indie scene. And it's something that Mike and I care about anyways. At the start of the pandemic a few years ago, Mike and I watched every Dragon Gate USA show, and not only broke down the shows themselves, but we broke down Gabe's emails and the drama on the indie scene at the time, and this, that, and the other thing. We tried to give a real 360 view of that time period, because we were, sort of some of the first people to revisit, say, a 2010s independent show and look at it from a historical perspective. And I say all of this to set up the fact that I think we're in Gen 3 of the US indie scene, and I'm not shy about saying this on the podcast. I think GCW is cancerous towards the professional wrestling industry. And I know that sounds harsh, but I mean it. I think they're bad for talent development. I think they're bad for industry growth. I think as long as they are the trendsetter, and they are, more so than a West Coast Pro, more so than an AAW, more so than even a Beyond Wrestling or any one of the IWTV properties, they are, like you said, I asked you the question, you said GCW. I think most people listening would agree. I just think they are terrible for the industry. They are terrible for what they represent. And it's not a bias. Brett Lauderdale has never done anything to personally wrong me. Professionally, I just find him to be incompetent. And I find his track record, whether it be the guys that were GCW mainstays that have gone on to sign major contracts, a Joey Janela, who flamed out in AEW and I think clearly wasn't up to snuff with the rest of the roster, or, a Blake Christian or an Alex Zane, guys that wound up in the Performance Center. And in my opinion, were some of the weakest WWE signees that have ever occurred, at least major indie names that the company has signed. Those guys were at the very bottom of the barrel. Those guys didn't work there. Now they're back. Or like you said, you have the Effies and the Alley Cats and those sorts of wrestlers. I have a fundamental disagreement with what wrestling is compared to names like those wrestlers. And that is what concerns me. That's why I said I was going to be pessimistic. I'm very concerned about the future of pro wrestling and the styles and the trends that are going to unfold, because I just don't think they're in the right hands. And, I would love for Chris Hero's West Coast Pro to all of a sudden be a buzzworthy promotion, and Friday nights the people in our Twitter bubble and beyond are staying home and we're watching Titus Alexander in a big title match because we have that level of investment in it. But we don't. That doesn't exist. And the thing that does exist, the thing that people care about the most, is something that is actively bad.
Yeah, and I think that's just a symptom of like all of the great talent gets signed really early. And so the talent that has some level of name recognition because they've been on the indies for years, there's a reason that they've been on the indies for years. And it's going to be hard to find people that I think like you and I are going to like as wrestlers. It's going to be a lot of like comedy guys and people like that. It's like GCW gaining so much popularity and kind of becoming the face of indie wrestling is largely just a symptom of the arms race from the larger promotions, and the drain on talent. And there's elements like the pandemic hurt talent development because indie wrestling didn't exist for a year or so. And so there's talent that needs to come along. And so there's kind of a weaknesses there. But in general, I think it's like that emergence is a symptom of kind of what happened to indie wrestling. Because of the arms race and because anyone that flashed any level of potential was going to get signed by either WWE or AEW, or even, signing with Impact or working a lot of New Japan dates and just not being as, relevant on the indies as they once were.
It's concerning to me when they anoint Tony Deppen as the work rate guy. And over the last 6 months, Tony Deppen has wrestled the following wrestlers. He's wrestled Yamato. He's wrestled Leo Rush. He's wrestled Jun Akiyama. He's wrestled Negro Casas. He's wrestled Shigehiro Irie. He's wrestled Brian Keith, and he's wrestled Zack Sabre Jr. And I think those are pretty elite names. And I've watched most of those matches, and the ones that I haven't seen, it's not like anybody's, running into my DMs to go, hey, man, you got to check this out. And the matches that I watched, I certainly wasn't running to my friends going, hey, man, you got to check this out. And so I guess I want to make my stance clear, because I was so harsh on GCW a minute ago is, the reason I don't like them is that I don't think they care. Like Gabe Sapolsky is a flawed human being. And I unfortunately find myself at times defending Gabe, which is never an advantageous position to be. But I think Gabe genuinely cared about wrestling and about developing talent and having a product that maybe aesthetically didn't look good, but a product that at the end of the day had a professional stamp on it. And I don't get the vibe from the core GCW crew that they like wrestling, and they don't have to like my kind of wrestling. I don't want every wrestler, I don't need every wrestler. I would love every wrestler if they just watched Gran Hamada tapes all day and said, this is what I'm going to do with my career. I actually think the industry might be better off for that, but I'm on an island there. But I don't know if it's a symptom, or I don't know if it's a cause or an effect rather, where the industry standard for wrestling criticism and wrestling analysis is so low that it creates a culture where when GCW is the trendsetter, like we said, now all of a sudden the bar for their work is so low. Because let me ask you, Jesse, other than voicesofwrestling.com, who we're obviously affiliated with, it's not a plug though, do you know wrestling websites that still will sit down and do a full match by match show review with detailed thoughts on every match and a star rating at the end of it? Does that exist in your bubble? Because it doesn't really exist in mine.
Just in general, like any promotion.
Yeah.
The Observer does it. Like
Yeah,
Dave
and
does it.
Dave does it to a painstaking degree because he's more so going move by move and not necessarily off of the emotion of the match, which is more so just a difference in writing philosophies. But I feel like when I was breaking into this bubble, which was a decade ago, and I really enjoyed listening to your podcast with Garrett Kidney because it was nice to listen to a podcast with wrestling fans who have 2000s cultural touchstones as when they were getting into wrestling, and then 2010s touchstones is getting into, for lack of a better term, the hardcore wrestling intelligentsia. Because I feel like when I broke into
What do you
this
mean?
bubble,
What do you mean by for lack of a better term? That's an excellent term.
as it's a Joe Lanza term, I'm
I
stealing it
know it
straight from
is.
him. That's for lack of a
The
better term.
hardcore
But
wrestling intelligentsia.
I feel like there was a point in time where it was like cool's not the right word, but it was in vogue to watch and discuss and critique wrestling. And I just feel like that has gone by the wayside. Like, and I asked this question on Open the Voice Gate a lot, and I never hear an answer that is what I'm looking for just in terms of satisfying this question. So you obviously have a different listener base. If somebody is listening to this podcast and maybe, they're 19, 20, 21 years old and then go, this is how I broke into this bubble. This is how I know about this podcast. And this is what the people my age are doing. I would love to know. But I know for me, like I broke in and it was like, okay, there's Alan Forel and there's Dylan Hales and there's Joe and Rich and there's the Pro Wrestling Only Forum. And all of these people fucking care about wrestling, and they're going to write paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs about the wrestling that they watch, and they're going to recommend this to you, and they're going to recommend this to you. And it was very easy for me to get lost in a world of footage in a good way, or almost consumed to an overwhelming degree by the amount of footage, because I was talking to people that really cared about what they were doing. And part of that was long form match analysis, and that has gone by the wayside. And so now we live in a world where if you're an up and coming wrestler, the standard for you is much lower, because you can have a 15-minute match, and instead of a Larry Zonka, rest in peace, or a TJ Hawk, somebody who I had very strong arguments with by the end of his time as, a wrestling reviewer, because I don't believe he really talks about it anymore. But you had people like that who, if you had a 15-minute match and minutes 6 through 11 were a train wreck, they would call you out for said train wreck, and it could affect your stock as an indie wrestler, especially with Larry Zonka, who people really cared about his opinion. Now, if you have a 15-minute match and matches 6 through 11 or minutes 6 through 11 are a train wreck, but minute 14, you do something really cool. Minute 14 is what matters. That gets passed around, and all of a sudden your bar for development is lower because you do the one thing that can get you booked on the next show. And it's not relevant whether or not you can put together a competent 15-minute match. And I think part of my disdain towards GCW is that somebody like Brett Lauderdale makes that worse. He leans into it. He leans into that ideology, and thus nobody gets better as long as they work for him.
Right. And you talk about, like, this has been brought up in a few different places, but if you were to go back to like the golden age of US Indies, whether that is Chikara, Ring of Honor, Evolve, all of those promotions were like, yeah, they would have wrestlers and they'd have guys just go out there and do cool moves and things like that. But they were all storyline driven to an extent. And there was like, we're going to put these wrestlers in storylines, and they're going to have feuds, and it's going to progress from show to show. And we're running enough for it to make sense. We're not like we're running once every 2 months. And wrestlers are not just guys who come in for a 15-minute match and have a 15-minute match, and that's it. There's storylines and kind of they're real pro wrestlers. They're not just guys having matches. And that's kind of lost on the modern indies for a variety of reasons. I think the economics are different. A lot of promotions aren't running with the frequency that they're going to need to kind of make that work.
But it's lost
different.
even on the talent that's involved currently. And I will once again have to come to the defense of Gabe Sapolsky, always a terrifying position to be in. But he had that dust up with Effie a month ago, and I don't care about the bulk of the argument. Who cares? This is his peak. If it is one, he'll never go anywhere further. If he does, great. I fully support what he's trying to do for marginalized groups in pro wrestling. I just happen to think he's a lousy pro wrestler and an annoying presence. But, he described Gabe's career as essentially, working with CM Punk at the right place and the right time. And again, I'm sorry, but that's just a complete misrepresentation of the work that Gabe was able to do. Forget just with CM Punk, but I don't know where you stand, but if you've ever seen a 2008, 2009 Johnny Gargano match, this was certainly not a guy ready for national TV. He wasn't ready for the elite tier of independent promotions at the time. And through working with Gabe consistently for 6 or 7 years straight, Gabe fostered him and developed him into a guy. We forget how good Johnny Gargano is now because at the end of the day, he's a Disney dork and somebody who at one point was the best thing about NXT, and then his own vices made him become the worst thing about NXT. But there was a point in time where Johnny Gargano was one of the best wrestlers in the world. And that is the kind of thing that Gabe would do for him and for Roderick Strong and for James Gibson and for Christopher Daniels. And to just say that, oh, he worked with CM Punk and that's why he's relevant is factually inaccurate. But I genuinely think with the modern indie scene, especially if you're in a position where Gabe is not going to get you a job given his current role, that is your thought of him. And that is a gross misrepresentation of almost 20 years of American wrestling history.
Yeah, and just the environment of indie wrestling is so different than it was like a big thing for me.
It's very bad.
No, GCW is the exception because GCW does run with a great frequency, and they would have the schedule and the ability to kind of put together things if they desired to do that, which they don't, which is the kind of the ultimate disappointing aspect of GCW. But just like the idea of like, I'm gonna have, storylines and feuds. Like, what was the last? I'm sure people can point out the things here and there, but what was like the last feud on the indies that you remember like people talking about? Like a real feud.
That's such a great question.
Like two wrestlers just having a series of matches over the course of maybe a couple of months.
The first thing that comes to mind, because I'm now trying to think of a genuine answer for this. I don't know if that was a rhetorical question or not, but I'm going to make sure it isn't. I can certainly point to Darby versus Ethan Page. Outside of the Gabe universe, I mean, God, I don't know. I mean, AAW tried a lot of different things with Sami Callihan, and I think you could. This will sound unintentionally like a put down towards Callihan. I think you could make the argument that Callihan versus AAW was certainly an attempt at that, but you have stumped me. I would love to know what the last notable U.S. indie feud was, because Darby versus Ethan Page is the for sure one that comes to mind.
Yeah, this one that just jumped out to me is David Starr versus Joey Janela in Beyond Wrestling.
Okay, and that would be a little bit later, I would assume, like 2018, 2019.
2019,
Okay.
They had the Iron Man match at the the American Rana 2019 show. But I'm talking like pre-pandemic, and
yeah,
like back when David Starr had a wrestling career. And so basically pre-AEW. I think AEW had existed, but Dynamite hadn't started yet by that time. So I just and that's the whole thing. And the reason I spend so much time talking about the indies is because I do think that the indies are the tastemakers for the broader wrestling picture. But we want to shift a little bit more towards like the major wrestling promotions and kind of respectively what they're doing. I want to bring this up with WWE because I do think so. If I'm operating under the idea that the indies, because of the various reasons which we all just discussed, have lost their ability to influence wrestling. What is going to influence wrestling? That's probably going to be the innovations and the ideas that we're seeing in WWE, that we're seeing in AEW, perhaps in some smaller promotions like Impact or MLW, but realistically, we're looking at that. And I've been thinking about this in WWE recently. WWE has done some different things over the last few years. And I've been thinking about a couple of them. And this is all from a match structure standpoint. The first is, I think these Roman Reigns matches where he cuts promos in the middle of the match, I'm wary that that is going to become some sort of industry staple for big matches. And that in the future, we're going to get like storytelling in pro wrestling is going to be like the wrestler explains the story to the audience at home while they're wrestling the match, which I can't stand. And I'm going to, if that's the future of wrestling, I'm going to turn into Jim Cornette. But that's something that I'm deeply concerned about.
Let me ask you this, because like with modern WWE, I am aware of things that are happening simply through the wrestling media that I consume, but what I actually watch of that product is so very little. It has the Roman Reigns talking during matches, has that died off a little bit? It was my understanding that wasn't as prevalent anymore, but maybe I'm incorrect. I mean, did he, for instance, did he do that in the Cody match?
Yes.
Oh my God.
It probably
right,
it probably peaked during like the Thunderdome era.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought. But if it was relevant in Zayn or the Cody matches, then it's still relevant.
It's still relevant. And if you watch the 6-man tag from Backlash, which is not even a Roman Reigns match, it's the Usos and Solo Sikoa versus Zayn, Sammy, Riddle, and Kevin Owens.
Oh,
like
God.
the Usos are doing it too. Like it's like we're gonna stomp on Sammy in the corner and we're gonna make faces into the camera and be, you could have been one of us, Us. You were like family, like just like this over dramatic stuff. And I obviously some people really respond to that. It's not for me, it's not for you, but some people really respond to that. And I'm worried, like, we're talking about what are these companies at the biggest level doing? And this is a match that the most fans are going to see and the most 10-year-olds are going to see that may grow up to become pro wrestlers. That's what they're seeing. And they're going to think that's what a main event wrestler is. And, we know how wrestlers like Shawn Michaels influenced just an incredible amount of people. And that was largely because not only was Shawn Michaels very talented, but Shawn Michaels was the WWE champion and was this super push commodity for a huge portion of his career in the biggest company in the world. And I do wonder if like we're going to have, I don't know if we're going to have Roman Reigns clones, because I don't think he's someone you can really clone. Just like we don't really have like Rock clones, or we don't even have John Cena clones. These people that have these looks are hard to clone. But I do think that I'm wondering, like, is that something that we're going to see more of in pro wrestling? Is this the new way to tell stories in pro wrestling instead of like the traditional way, which I think most people would prefer? It's instead going to be this, you talk during the match and explain the story so the slowest of belt mutants can keep up with it.
Do you think that style of wrestling is the talking during the matches, is that done as an in-ring style, or is that done as a production quirk? Because I'm having a hard time gauging the idea that somebody might be doing this in front of 30 people. I don't know if it's merely a symptom of face the hard cam, don't pay attention to the audience, and looking at it as more of a production staple than an in-ring staple. But I guess I'm curious as to what you think about that.
It's probably a combination of both. Like, you're right. I don't see somebody, on like a Deadlock Pro show, like doing that necessarily. But I could see it in the right setting. That kind of style being told. And look, there's been elements of this that have existed in wrestling since the industry began, right? Like guys talking shit in the ring. That's not like a new innovative idea. But there's something about the specific WWE production quality that makes it a bigger part of the match than I think most people would want it to be. And there's also this element to like, I think like Roman Reigns is like, in maybe this is a Paul Heyman idea, like philosophically, my matches need to be these, if I'm going to have these big sweeping epic long matches, I'm going to tell my story this way, which is like there's going to be a 10-minute heat period where I'm just going to be stomping on a guy and punching him, and I'm going to need to fill that time with storytelling. And historically in wrestling, if someone wanted to tell a story, they would do it mostly through physical action and emotion. And this is really reliant instead on verbal, um, in a more extreme way than we've ever seen before. And
Yeah,
I think
it's certainly bad. I mean, I don't like the direction that it's going.
I get the sense that like whether it's WWE or Roman himself, like I think that they think they're doing like high art, and they're certainly
Oh my
getting
God, yes.
praised from their fan base or a certain segment of their fan base that thinks that they are. I would always tell people, I'm like, there's something I'd be concerned if like the people that are like the bloodline is the greatest storyline of all time, and I was like, the bloodline is like the most simple storyline to understand of all time because it's extremely repetitive. The matches tell you exactly what's happening. They tell you exactly what's happening in the matches. They tell you, they verbally tell you what's happening in the matches. It's the easiest storyline to follow. And if it's your favorite storyline of all time, God bless you. But it makes me think you're an idiot because it's like it feels like it's the only storyline you've been able to comprehensively follow because it was dumbed down for, like I said, the slowest of belt mutants, the lowest common denominator can understand it.
I'm with you. My hope since the beginning of AEW is that the phrase I've always used is that they will help de-Kleenex professional wrestling in the same way that tissue is now a synonym with Kleenex for our entire lives. Because you're in your late 20s, correct?
Yeah, I'm 28.
Okay, yeah, so I'm 24. So WCW closed when I was 2. My entire life, everybody my age, and these are now people that are in the workforce that, if they're well off, own homes, or at the very least are college graduates, our entire lives have been defined by a monopoly on wrestling. WWE is wrestling. That is the only wrestling. TNA never had any cultural significance in the way that AEW did from their first show onward. So I've always used the phrase, I would like for AEW to de-Kleenex wrestling. And I think WWE has hit this point, at least I hope. I'm going to be so saddened if I'm incorrect, but they have hit a point, I think very akin to like a Coldplay. The band Coldplay, they're massive. They're undeniably huge, but they no longer make music with any sort of cultural significance. They might release an album that has a #1 single, and it's the #1 album in America, and the next time they come to Chicago, just like they did the most recent time, they'll sell out 2 nights at Soldier Field. But did anybody really hear the new Coldplay album? It exists in this vacuum. It's the splintering of Gen Pop, and I hope that we've now hit a point where WWE is so removed from the idea of pro wrestling, and I think both that is happening and that is their goal, that those quirks that exist there will stay there, and that the hive mind, both behind the scenes and the puppets in the media that promote these ideologies, will keep it within the bounds of that promotion, and that in AEW and on the US indie scene, and God forbid it ever spread to Japan. If it spread to Japan, it would be, kiboshed immediately. I think this is something that you're right in the sense we will see it grow within the context of that promotion. I hope and I pray, and I don't think it will grow outside of there.
Yeah, and I think that's a real point, which is that WWE is so far removed, and they themselves believe that they're so far removed from like the rest of the pro wrestling world that their ability to influence the rest of that pro wrestling world is limited. I think the other thing that I'd be really I'm like kind of concerned about is like the Dominic Mysterio, like we're gonna boo Dom to be fun meme, and we're gonna manipulate the crowd audience so the crowd thinks that he's getting more heat than he really is, or it teaches the crowd to boo him if they're listening at home. Oh my God, look at all the people booing Dom Mysterio. When I go there, I better boo him too. And there's something very hollow about that, and inorganic and manipulative. And wrestling has always been about manipulating an audience to get a desired reaction. But there's something so like unorganic about that. And about the idea of like, yeah, you're gonna boo this guy, but we're not really gonna boo him. We're booing him because we want to be part of the show. And there's this level of self-awareness, and there's this idea of like, we're gonna just straight up change the audio on our broadcasts to give off the desired reaction we want. And it's so phony and it's so inauthentic and it's creates this hollow emotionalist product. And I don't know if another wrestling company would ever kind of have the production capacity for starters to kind of do that. But it is like, if I'm looking at what is some new innovative thing that WWE is doing, that is something that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, look, if any other promotion started doing that, if I found out that AEW was, forget piping in noise, but simply just manipulating audio to a degree that it creates something that isn't there, I'm out. I won't make the bold declaration that I'll never watch again, but any emotional investment that I have in that promotion would just go by the wayside. And I think it's embarrassing as WWE continues to just swarm up media outlets to have the cushiest analysis possible, that this is something that people have just accepted. It's bizarre to me that they just started doing this and everybody was like, okay, and Dom is getting great heat. That was the fallout of all of this, was just mere acceptance and compliance. And I don't know how you get to that point where, again, Joe Lanza made that point in the flagship last week, and you just brought it up there. The audience is there to be a part of a show. They're not there to boo Dominic because they don't like him. They're there to boo Dominic because that's what you're supposed to do. And that is embarrassing to be a part of. If you accept that as your role as the audience member, it's embarrassing that we have members of the media, specifically in high profile outlets like The Ringer, where they excel in every other thing that they cover. They have the worst wrestling analysis possible. And they play along with it. It's all so bad. And it gives me hope that, again, they will just exist in their own universe. And we can eventually get to a point where AEW, Ring of Honor, the Indies, CMLL, New Japan, Dragon Gate, they can all exist in a universe, and only those factors can affect that world. And WWE is just off on its own planet, and only they can affect themselves. I mean, that is my long-term goal of what I want to see. Whether or not that happens, I don't know.
Well, I think it's already kind of happening, right? I think like AEW is far more influential in the rest of the wrestling world than WWE is.
The only thing that isn't there is just merely the arms race for talent. And I guess we'll see, with this idea that there's a hiring freeze on the Endeavor side, if that is the final nail in the coffin there. I want to get to a point where they have nothing to do with one another.
Yeah, and I think like with WWE really going much heavier on like, we're gonna sign these college athletes and we're gonna put them on NXT TV and they're all gonna come from the Performance Center and that's our future. And we're not gonna be signing, the Johnny Garganos of the world, the Tommaso Ciampas of the world, the indie wrestlers coming up that are gonna perhaps steal the spotlight from these greener college athletes. They will have a whole army of, and I don't know if they'll ever be good, I don't know if they'll ever be popular or over, but they have the whole army of people that maybe don't have a huge natural passion for wrestling, don't really know anything outside of WWE, but this is their careers to be a WWE superstar, and their entire perspective of pro wrestling is shaped on what they're taught at the Performance Center, which is just so different than what seems to be taught anywhere else in pro wrestling. And that will help cement further the company away from a company based with any connection to the rest of the pro wrestling universe. Right now, because so many of the wrestlers on the WWE main roster are wrestlers that have gained experience working for other places outside of WWE, it's still there's still obvious connections with the rest of the wrestling world. But if we're moving into the future and there's not going to be your Sami Zayn who spent 15 years on the US Indies before getting signed by WWE, there's not going to be a Kevin Owens, there's not going to be a Cody Rhodes who went to AEW and learned and went to the US Indies and had learned this whole new perspective on wrestling. Those people are not going to be signed. You are going to see that connection kind of severed.
So let me bring this up real quick, because if we're going to talk about the future of wrestling, I think, talent development, and you and I are not speaking as wrestlers nor trainers, which makes this conversation a little bit awkward, but I do think we have to, in the same way that I was quick to point the finger at GCW and say, you guys are the problem, you guys aren't developing talent, you guys suck. we do have to look at the two majors for just a second and realize that one, and I think you would be on the same page with me here, that the Performance Center has now existed for a decade. And I personally believe we all have a duty, myself included, and I don't do this. We should all log on to the internet every day, and whether it's in an email thread with friends, a message board, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, we should all log on to the internet every day and remind all of our followers about the abysmal failure that is the Performance Center. We don't, as the wrestling media, make a big enough deal about just what a colossal waste of time, energy, and money this thing has been. And when I asked this question about a year ago of, okay, who is the shining star in the decade that this building has been around? One, I had people say, Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn. No, okay, that's not what I'm looking for here. But I got a list of NXT women's wrestlers, and I personally find that style of modern WWE women's wrestling to be insulting because of how awkward it looks and how light the strikes are and how choreographed it all seems. And I got Braun Strowman. And if you're hanging your hat on Braun Strowman, you have done a terrible job there. So I don't feel bullish about the future of wrestling if it's in the hands of the Performance Center.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. I've done plenty of Performance Center bashing on here. I've done a lot of it on WrestleNomics as well. It's just, I just think their philosophical approach to what they want to teach these people to do is just different than anything else. I was watching, there was a WWE pay-per-view match from last year. I believe it was Baron Corbin versus Madcap Moss.
Oh my God. This already sounds so bad, by the way. Go ahead.
And the match itself, the match was bad in such a unique to WWE way. Because fundamentally, the match wasn't super problematic. No one botched moves. No one missed stuff by a mile. They didn't blow spots. There was nothing wrong from a fundamental aspect. It's two guys who were very good natural athletes that have a decent amount of experience being in a wrestling ring and executing their moves and things like that.
You very rarely see in contemporary wrestling blown spots and botched moves in the way you did in the 80s and 90s. As negative as I am about the future of wrestling, the standard of wrestling has gone up exponentially.
Specifically wrestling on TV, as long as it's not, except for NXT, but if you go back and watch any episode of television wrestling, the number of straight up 1-star matches that existed would be incredible. If a
it's
match
insane.
If you read an old Observer, if a match is 2 3/4 stars, it's that's pretty good.
I mean, it's it's the I don't know if this reference will make sense to you specifically, but Segunda Cato, who is a website that still does in-depth wrestling analysis, long form match reviews. I love them. I happen to think most of their writers are insane in the things that they prefer about wrestling, but they will look at late era WWECW, Christian Cage and Matt Hardy and Fit Finlay, as this pinnacle of television wrestling. And it's not that it's bad by any means, but given that we live in the Dynamite era, you go back and watch some of that's a nice 3-star match for Matt Hardy, but it's oh my God, Matt Hardy had a 3-star match on TV. This is so much better than anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's like I said, a good WWE match will be the third best match on a episode of Dynamite.
Oh, completely.
But there's a but yeah, so I was watching this Madcap Moss Baron Corbin match. I got to get back on track here with this incredible story that I'm going to tell. And so the match fundamentally is fine, but it was so uniquely bad in a WWE because these people have no actual charisma. They have this performative charisma that they teach in the Performance Center, and it's Madcap Moss he's going to throw Baron Corbin into the ropes, and he's going to give him a clothesline, and he's going to look at the hard camera, and he's going to make a face. And I know backstage WWE yeah, good job. That's what we want you to do, Madcap. That's telling a story, brother. that's how we do it. But I was just like, man, these guys have no individuality. They wrestle like robots. They wrestle like everyone else that they teach in WWE, and they're doing exactly what management wants them to do. And if the future is just like an army of these, 6'3", 250-pound guys with good bodies that are doing all these things, nobody is going to get over. They're going to be given these wacky gimmicks, like we've got Happy Corbin and we've got Madcap Moss that nobody cares about. And it's like, this can't be your future. It can't be. There's going to be no emotional attachment from the audience. But
I would at least prefer that future where they're over 6 feet tall, because that at least that offers something. I'm so much more bothered by, I will specifically name Sol Ruka, the woman at NXT, because the faux athleticism and the faux junior heavyweight wrestling that occurs in that promotion. I oftentimes on Open the Voice Gate, we record on Tuesday night, so we'll record as NXT is going on, and if I see a GIF that annoys me while we're recording at the end of the episode, like I'll have Mike and I live react to it, because, look, my philosophy on the future of wrestling is do what Dragon Gate is doing, because they've developed talent throughout the pandemic that are now leading the promotion. They have an army of wrestlers younger than 25 that are ready to step up and headline their 5 major shows of the year. If you extend that to younger than 30, that's basically everybody relevant on the roster at this point, minus 1 or 2 names. But it's insulting to me watching Dragon Gate, these guys that are machines that wrestle 150 times a year and never make a mistake and do things at a lightning quick pace. I always say a 3.5-star Dragon Gate 6-man tag is a 4.5-star match in America, because it would blow people's minds at the precision and the execution of what they see. And then I see Sol Ruka cartwheel into a head scissors at a snail-like pace, and it makes me want to pull my buzz cut out. I have no hair, but it makes me want to pull my hair out, because it is so horrific, and that bothers me more. And I'm afraid that wrestling is actually going in that direction of this almost, it's like diet Dragon Gate. It's like people know, okay, if we do cool spots, the audience will pop for it, but they have no understanding of what it is that they're doing, and so they're devaluing the entire art form as a result of it.
I think we're talking about, like, with NXT, which is like, we're going to go out and we're going to get all these people that are athletic, like real athletes from college, which they've been doing forever. They've marketed the idea, like the next in line, the NIL name image likeness deals are new because they're new to NCAA sports, but WWE's kind of used that as a marketing scheme, where it's like, we've got this new idea, we're going to get college athletes and we're going to recruit them to be pro wrestlers, which has existed for 100, quite literally.
It's been their philosophy for 20 years. They've tried to get college wrestlers for 20. That's Johnny Ace's whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, college football players like The Rock, like Steve Austin, like John Cena, like Roman Reigns. Like, all of your biggest stars were college athletes. The Undertaker, Randy Savage. I guess Randy Savage wasn't a college athlete, because I don't think he went to college, but he was a minor league baseball player. But they get these people who are legitimately athletic, and I'm sure that you can do, like, if you were to do like a NFL combine style thing, with which they do with these wrestlers, they would do very, very well, and they look very impressive. And the women they get are athletic and they can do these moves, but they're kind of taught to do them kind of at half speed, and they have this idea of, like, just do some cool things that will stand out and create a moment and will be on a GIF on social media, but there's no actual connectivity within their matches. It's like, and they're often doing them at half speed because they're green rookies, and what they're doing should probably not be on national television.
I do want to be fair, and just briefly, I guess I don't mean to direct your ship, but I do want to bring up AEW in this discussion, because I do think it's worth mentioning. This is a promotion that's been around for 4 years now, and I don't have the philosophy or understanding of what it is that wrestlers should be doing to ascend to the next level. But I am a little concerned with the fact that, a Lee Johnson or a freak beast Nick Camarado, who by look alone should be the world heavyweight champion, or even like a Max Caster, guys like that. Anybody that was involved in the factory, a Jungle Boy, even Powerhouse Hobbs. They have a lot of good young wrestlers, but I've yet to see anybody, with the exception of MJF specifically, make the leap in AEW from being a good wrestler to a great wrestler. Because think about who dominates, for lack of a better term, the spreadsheet matches in that company. It's Kenny Omega and the Bucks and Moxley and Phoenix. It's guys that were going to be good and going to have great matches, whether or not they had Tony Khan behind them. It's the second generation of guys where, has Jungle Boy gotten better in 4 years? Yeah, but is he a great wrestler? No. And the guys that are involved with the factory, I loved that gimmick when it came out, because I was like, oh, cool, these are young guys that I'm going to be able to get behind. They're like prospects that, my favorite thing is supporting a young wrestler. That's part of the reason I love Dragon Gate so much, is they just pump out all of these new kids and they're all super talented. This is going to be the equivalent of that. And none of those guys have really worked out, and it's less on the surface. I can point to NXT and go, this is why I hate this wrestler, this is why I hate this wrestler, they all suck. I don't know what the problem is in AEW, but I do know that there's a problem with guys ascending to that next level.
Yeah, I think part of it in AEW is that AEW's added a lot of top talent, so guys get pushed down the card further, which makes it harder for them to stand out.
That makes sense. I think that's a very fair critique.
When the company first started, I don't want to use the 4-pillar branding, and I don't want to talk about the 4 pillars that much. Oh my
god! But, I want the 4 pillars to go away.
Well, but like the idea is like when it first started, like these are the 4 guys we're going to build around a company, because they're all well under 30 at the time, and we don't have a ton of top talent. But since that very first AEW show, just think about all the people that they brought in. They brought in Bryan Danielson. They brought in Adam Cole. They brought in CM Punk. They just brought in Jay White. They're bringing in all of these people that are going to kind of have to be pushed at a certain level. And it made it much more difficult for that new talent to start out. Like if you want to talk about one of the reasons Dragon Gate has the ability to kind of have a lot of young wrestlers and push them right away is obviously it's a very strong fundamental view of the way the company is run, that and they've never been shy about out with the old and in with the new. But part of it is because they needed them. They needed to have new stars, because guys like Yoshino were retiring. Guys like BB Hulk had serious injuries. Your old guard got older. Shingo left.
Look, Shima left, and Shima took two main guys with him, and
the future guys. Yeah,
in Lindemann and T-Hawk, and it didn't work out due to injury. But not to dive into Dragon Gate lore here, but the main scare when Shima left was, okay, Shima's gone, that's going to hurt us at the box office. But Shima took Takahiro Yamamura, who, for all of the young Dragon Gate guys that have come through over the last decade, Yamamura was the golden boy. I mean, he was the one that everybody expected to ascend to the top of the card, and was doing so. And then he has had some of the worst luck with not only injuries, but serious life-altering injuries in modern history, at least that I can remember. And I know he's trying to come back to the ring, but I hope he doesn't, because he is. It's very similar to Tua Tagovailoa, where even if he can do it, I don't want to see him do it, because I've seen him go through so much pain where it's just like, I don't need this. But anyways,
right. My point is that there was, in Dragon Gate and other promotions that have succeeded at this, there was a real need to elevate that talent. Yes. In AEW, because they've added so much talent that they just can toss into the main event, and kind of have to, based on if they're paying them a lot of money, and obviously the star power aspect of it has kind of put some of these talent from a storyline perspective in the back seat. Now, is that talent getting better? Like, fundamentally, are they getting better at pro wrestling? I think that's a fair question. I think, are they wrestling with enough frequency to get better? I think there are a lot of promising wrestlers in AEW. You mentioned Lee Johnson, guy like Alan Angels, guys that AEW signed and just really haven't done anything with them.
Yeah, I always point to Nick Camarado because I just that guy, for as open-minded as I am about what wrestling is and what it could be, I look at the Freak Beast, a man who, by the way, goes by the name Freak Beast, and I go, that is a pro wrestler. He should be pushed as hard as possible, as soon as possible. And he came in the pandemic, he came in those Daily's Place shows, and every time I see him wrestle, he doesn't seem better than he was in 2020, and that's what concerns me. Now, I do think the point of, hey, they don't need them is very fair, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I hadn't really looked at it from that perspective. But I do worry about it becoming a pro wrestling Noah situation where they had Masawa and Kobashi and Akiyama and even Takayama, and then what? Kenta and Marufuji had the talent, but they didn't have the box office pull, and they're now on 20 years of being able to really produce a worthwhile wrestler from their dojo, Kaito Kiyomiya included. So it's just an endless cycle of pushing old guys, having it not work, trying a new generation, going back to the guys that are older than the new generation, and rinse and repeat, and it will be that way until the end of time.
Yeah, and so I think those are all, and I think those are all fair aspects of criticism aimed at AEW. I think that I think AEW's like biggest influence is just educating a population on non-WWE style wrestling. Like you mentioned, like people our age don't remember WCW. I never watched a single episode of WCW. I was 6 years old when it closed. I was 5 when it closed. I didn't really start watching wrestling until 2005. So long after, not only with WCW closed, but kind of the invasion had come and gone. Goldberg had come back to the company and left the company. Like the first major, I didn't watch it live, but like the first major WWE match I can remember, like building up towards, is the John Cena versus JBL I Quit match at Judgment Day, which is famous for John Cena being very, very bloody in it. But that's like what I remember. Like that's years removed from WCW, and I'm almost 30. So
yeah, I mean, look, I was a child when WWE ECW started with no knowledge of what had come before.
right.
My childhood knowledge of ECW was Rob Van Dam and CM Punk at the Big Show, and then Sabu, who was super over with me until he no longer worked there. But yeah, it's nice to have a similar cultural touchstone there. Like I said, it was very fun listening to the Garrett Kennedy episode.
You don't remember the Attitude Era, Case?
Yeah, it's well, that's another trend where, okay, so even if you have young wrestlers that are watching wrestling, I don't trust that they're watching the right things. I always harp on the idea that there was a point in time where talent got snatched up and things were happening and things were transitioning, and Ethan Page all of a sudden was like a prominent indie wrestler. And it's like, well, what horrible nightmare are we living in where this Attitude Era cosplayer suddenly has pull, and some people are going to pay to see him. It's awful.
Well, you mentioned Tony Deppen kind of is like now like the ace of the indies.
Oh,
and it reminds me of like when a sports team, like an NBA team, like they just traded away their best star player. They're going into total rebuilds, and like they need to have a player that's like on the cover for the programs. And like I remember the first time LeBron left Cleveland. And it was like the opening night for the Cavs the next season, like the guy who gets like the hammer spot in the like starting lineups. I think it was Mo Williams, and it was like, is Mo Williams like the most disappointing person to be like now in like the everybody get hyped spot? And it's like
Anderson Varejao is built different.
It was LeBron last year, and it's one of those people.
Zrudas Ilgauskas is leading this team to glory.
Hey, this is Case, calm down. This is not a podcast that slanders Zydrunas Ilgauskas.
No, I have nothing bad to say about it.
The Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast loves Big Z. But to touch on like, I guess like AEW again, is I think AEW's job, that's basically going to be AEW's job. And but I do think like AEW basically taking all of the And to get back to kind of my original point about like big moves kind of fading away as far as a real taste making kind of thing, is AEW has kind of like because its company has taken a lot of the what was popular on the US Indies and brought it to national attention. By doing so has kind of ended the period where that style of wrestling could be innovative and it can be still influential because people now it can be seen by the masses, but it's still it kind of ended the idea of like this is the new experimental cool stuff. It is now mainstream. It is now part of the culture. What's next? It has to be something new. I want to bring up something really quick.
Yeah, please.
It was an article that was written on voiceofwrestling.com. And it was by you and Cameron. And he mentioned something kind of really interesting. He talks about kayfabe and that's a big aspect of wrestling today is that kayfabe is completely dead and promotions are kind of often thinking about how they can get around it. And something he mentioned, he talks about AEW and how AEW uses this idea of by acting like we're telling the truth, but still kind of speaking in kayfabe, it creates this image where AEW is able to get to work, quote unquote, work fans, but by doing so, and he mentions an interview with John Moxley where he mentions this thing about Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, and Moxley says a lot of people out there hate on the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega. We're obviously attacking them and have our issues with them, but we are not old ass fucking bitter dudes with podcasts talking about how the business used to be. It's us against the universe. That attitude is AEW at its core. The idea is that like John Moxley is shooting there, which he might be, but he's also speaking in a kayfabe sense because he knows that's the image he wants AEW to put out there. And Ewan mentions that like what we would consider the new kind of kayfabe and work aspect of professional wrestling is in a lot of ways what we would consider, marketing or branding, of this idea of we're going to peel back the curtain and we're going to explain to you what's real about us. But it's all still done under the veneer of this is entertainment for entertainment purposes only. And the wrestlers that best use social media do that as well. And you see that both in AEW and WWE. But I think a huge part of AEW's image from a business, from a product standpoint, is this idea that we are the alternative. We are the new thing. We are not like WWE. And they hammer that home as much as possible because they understand that it's a valuable position to be in. And I do think that that is kind of like a new interpretation of where wrestling is headed and what kind of the way we're going to tell stories, the way we're going to get talent over is going to be utilizing that idea of working with the idea that fans know it's fake and how we can kind of use that to our own advantage. I think it's I don't know if it's good. I don't know if it's bad. I just think it's very different than what we had seen previously in wrestling history when it comes to trying to get stuff over.
Well, I like it because I don't want wrestlers to be my real life friends. And I think that is where there's a real disconnect, especially with wrestlers on the indies where, look, I get it. It's a hustle. You got to sell your shirts to make some more money. But I refuse to buy into the notion that we just have to accept that wrestling is fake and we shouldn't try to persuade people otherwise. And, there's no point in pretending to kayfabe anything anymore. That is the worst philosophy you can possibly have. I really liked Ewan's article on voiceofwrestling.com. I also really like the way that Tony Khan handles most of this stuff. I love gossip. I love wrestling rumors, but I also think in the same way that we've lost long form match analysis, it has been traded in. Instead of everybody having a website where they review matches, everybody is now just aggregating quotes. And it's led to, first of all, just a horribly toxic discourse, but wrestlers and wrestling promoters need to use that to their advantage and throw away the idea of merch table culture or on the national TV level, this idea that you're friends with any of these people and they need to lean into this. I fully support the Moxley quote, for example. That's exactly what I'm looking for from a pro wrestler. I almost wish they would lean in harder to it. And from the little bit I've seen of this All Access show they're doing, I wish it was presented a little bit more like wrestling was real. I still buy into that concept that wrestling should be presented as a sport and not all of this behind the scenes access going. So here's how Britt Baker and I put together this match.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was talking to Brandon Thurston about this over the weekend. Specifically, Brandon mentioned that there's like this so this goes back to like a Vince Russo era WCW and the idea of like the worked shoot and things like that. So 25 years ago, there's this whole concern, which is that kayfabe is dead. All the fans know that the product is real. So the only way, how can we, because they know it's fake, they're gonna have they have the false assumption that because wrestling fans know it's fake, they're not going to have an emotional investment in the matches. And the way to kind of work them is to do these worked shoot things where they pretend that they're acknowledging something that's real behind the curtain, but it's all still a work because everyone's just pretending that they're acknowledging it and pretending that they're making some real quote unquote comments about something. And this idea is this is the only way we can still work the fans is by leaning into those aspects of it. And I think that element still exists in pro wrestling today. This idea that we're going to swerve fans and we're going to try to, tease something and then, we worked you, marks. And I think that's still like this idea of what wrestling needs to do because that's how wrestling existed before, which is all the fans allegedly thought it was real, even though they didn't. And I think that, like the future of wrestling and the future of wrestling fandom needs to for wrestling to reach its modern potential, it needs to embrace the fact that the fans know that it's fake, understand that the fans know it's fake, but present the product as if it's real. And I think most wrestling fans want to, like we talked about like WWE fans, like, oh, they want to be part of the show, like it's a negative thing. And
Yeah.
there are elements to it too. But wrestling fans in general want to be part of the show. They want to cheer the good guy. They want to boo the bad guy. They need to be sold on why they should do those things to a degree. But the idea that wrestling fans are incapable of an emotional investment because they know that it's fake, or the only way they can really get riled up is because if they think something real is happening or something real is gonna happen, is ridiculous. We're at the point where wrestling fans are watching a show live the same way they might watch an Avengers movie or they might watch Star Wars or something like that. And I think you just have to embrace the fact that our fans are smart. Our fans are going to react to the stories that we're going to tell. We need to give them a reason for why we think they should cheer for the good guy and they should boo for the bad guy and why they should be supportive of this intended booking result. But it has to come from it comes from a place of a lot more respect for the fans than the old ways, which is like, how can we trick these fans and to manipulate them into a reaction instead of embracing the idea that the fans are really willing to suspend their disbelief. And that's oftentimes I really run up against people who look at wrestling super critically is because they seem to lack absolutely no ability to suspend their disbelief. And I just don't understand how you can be a wrestling fan like that because it's fucking wrestling. Like, how could you ever be a fan of wrestling without the ability to just suspend your disbelief for a brief moment?
I always think of there's a very famous Dragon Gate match. It's Shingo versus Masaki Mochizuki from 2015. And I think it's, if not one of the 10 best wrestling matches of all time, it's certainly falling into my top 25. And I remember logging on to the Pro Wrestling Only forum, and somebody had written this very long match review about everything that was wrong with this match. And it's, a 25-minute world title match or whatever. And they're like, about 8 minutes in, Shingo throws 2 weak-looking punches, and that's where they lost me. And it's just like, well, you don't like this. If that's your complaint, you just don't like the art form. If 2 quote-unquote weak-looking punches are going to take you out of this thing, it's the same idea as like, oh, there were too many rope running spots. It's like, well, you go watch MMA. This isn't for you. But I think to put a bow on what you eloquently said there, I'm not convinced that the new generation of wrestlers necessarily like wrestling. And I know there's a faction of wrestling media that will shame you for liking wrestling, but I do think, and Tony Khan has proved this, that there's a very large fan base out there that primarily wants to consume in-ring good wrestling. And I think the future, although it concerns me from a talent development standpoint, there's very few times in history where there's been better wrestling, and I'm glad that AEW is at least fostering that on a national TV front.
Right, and AEW, for the plenty of faults it has, and this week, despite the positive announcement yesterday, has had it also exposed some of the faults that AEW has. Ultimately, I think, like, you're right. It's a product that is leaning into the idea of, well, let's put out good matches. Let's make exciting things happen on a wrestling show. Let's present new characters, different people that maybe WWE wouldn't present as top stars. And it has been warmly embraced by many more people than I would have expected. I don't think AEW gets nearly enough credit for the fact that only a few years ago, largely the same wrestlers who are on AEW now were wrestling in front of like maybe 1,000 people on a Ring of Honor show.
Oh, they absolutely don't get the credit for it, and they won't in the current media landscape.
The fact that AEW just basically emerged as a company that could do 750,000 to 1 million viewers each week and be a top, Dynamite can be a top 5 show on its night and cable television, and they can get another hour of Rampage. They now have another 2-hour show on Collision. They're obviously not as popular as WWE, but just basically going from where non-WWE wrestling was pre-AEW from a popularity or a mainstream popularity standpoint to what it is now, the amount of people that know who the Young Bucks are, the amount of people that will pop for a Kenny Omega match in America, there's hundreds of thousands of more people that they've added over the last few years than what existed before. And I think that it kind of got taken for granted because they hit that level so quickly. And now people are like, whoa, when they started, they were doing this, and now they're doing this, and it's actually worse. And Tony Khan doesn't know how to grow his audience, and Tony Khan doesn't know how to reach the casual fan, all this stuff that people say. And I just think it's the actual immediate established fan base that AEW was able to produce that has led to them being what appears to be, we don't have the details yet, but appears to be on the path for a very financially successful company, has been mostly underappreciated, I think, in general.
I guess the positivity to come from this is, we're not at a point where it feels like American wrestling is on the brink. This industry is going to be around for a while. Now, if you want to flip the conversation to Japan, and we don't have time to do that right now, but I would warn people, especially if you have not listened to the Open the Voice Gate episodes we've done with Dragon Gate J, who is their English commentator. If you have any investment in Japanese wrestling, I would really go back and listen to the most recent episode we did. It was like 3 weeks ago. You can find it pretty easily on the Open the Voice Gate feed. We only lost one wrestling company in Japan during the pandemic, which was Wrestle One, and that was going to close with or without COVID. And that's not speculation. That's a fact. That company was done in April of 2020 with or without COVID. But because everyone has survived, I think it has possibly given people some false hope. Whereas in reality, thank God that New Japan and Stardom have a corporation behind them. Thank God that No One DDT have a corporation behind them. And thank God for the Lek Corporation, who make home cleaning products. Their owner is a literal money mark. And those 3 factors, 2 major corporations and a money mark, have helped keep that industry alive. So things are not as perky on the Japan side of things, but at least in America, there's money behind wrestling, and that's not going anywhere.
I was going to ask you this really quickly. Do you think, because we started talking about Dragon Gate and obviously the influence that Dragon Gate has had on American wrestling in general.
Yeah.
Do you think from like a product standpoint, Dragon Gate is still innovating? Or are they just still excelling at a pattern style that has been developed for a long time and become the trademark of the company?
I think they're innovating. I just don't think the right people are paying attention to it. I made the point about 4 years ago now to Alan Forel. We were on a podcast on his show on Pro Wrestling Torch. and we were talking about at the time this young generation of rookie wrestlers, Shun Skywalker and Dragon Dai and Kaito Ishida, who was a few years into his career, but he had been injured, so he was on their level. And, I started talking to Alan about, man, these guys wrestle really differently than a Shima or a Mochi or a Shingo. They're kind of doing this bantamweight style that is less high spot oriented and more like knockouts could happen in Dragon Gate matches. Like, they're doing high spots, but they're more physical than they've ever been. And I think the Dragon Gate house style, although I will always maintain, and I fight some people on this, the idea of Dragon Gate as a promotion is the same as it was during the hot period a decade ago. It was largely the same as it was when it was Toryumon. The idea of Dragon Gate is the same, but I do think the in-ring style has shifted yet again to something that looks different than a New Japan, looks different than an All Japan, looks different than anything that's going on in America. I do think they're innovating in terms of that overall house style and the moves that are going on within it, but Dragon Gate to the English-speaking consumer has never meant less than it does now. So it's not influencing the way that it should.
Right, and we talked about it briefly, like a lot of the Dragon Gate wrestlers, some of their biggest stars were in the United States, working US Indies. And so, it's not like they had there weren't good matches that took place, but it didn't seem like there was really any buzz about it at all. And that's just that a lot of that is just a symptom of the US Indies. I know that I think some of them struggled to get, you'll know a lot more about this than I did. Some of them got struggled to get consistent bookings, which is ridiculous when you consider the state of
I mean, that was that. So SB Kento, who, if you've never seen him wrestle, he's basically Dragon Gate's Adam Cole in the sense that he is immensely talented. He, at 21 years old, was a headlining star. And it was one of those situations where you went, oh my God, if he was 3 inches taller, imagine what he could be. Because even for Dragon Gate standards, he's pretty small, but they shipped off SB Kento to America last year. He was based in Mexico and then based in Orlando. So he could work both Mexico and America. And he eventually caught on in Mexico. There were some people over there that when he initially was shipped over, they were like, nah, don't get it, whatever. Those people are now super into it. So he won those people over. But there was a weekend, I think it was in October, where SB Kento was very public facing about it, tweeted out, he's like, I'm in Orlando. Somebody book me. I want to wrestle on your shows. And it met with silence. I talked to US indie promoters because once they found out that there were Dragon Gate guys in America, a lot of promoters reached out to me and were like, okay, what are these guys doing? If there were 5 or 6 names available, I would say, well, you should be looking at these guys. These guys are available, and if you have the money, they can come too. Like, that was kind of the way that I broke it down. And every single time SB Kento was available, promotions would go with Yamato instead, because Yamato was around in Ring of Honor and Dragon Gate USA. They know that name, and even if somebody like SB Kento is a big deal in Japan, which he is in the context of Dragon Gate, that star power means nothing, because people are only going to remember Yamato versus BB Hulk from the first Dragon Gate USA show. That's their knowledge of Dragon Gate. It doesn't extend beyond that. And somebody like SB Kento is shit out of luck.
You're stuck in a nostalgia loop, like many of the major promotions in the US are. It's just like,
yes,
you got to put people. We got to put Edge in this big match because people remember Edge.
People still think Dragon Gate is Blood Generation versus Doofixer, and I'm always baffled because I try to consume any bit of English-oriented Dragon Gate content that I can find. So, the Reddit thread every once in a while we'll just randomly post, hey, it's Doofixer versus Blood Generation. It's free on YouTube, and I'll just read comment after comment after comment of, God, these guys are so good. How can I should really be watching Dragon Gate. How can I watch Dragon Gate? And then it just never manifests itself in anything. I mean, I feel like that's always the ongoing.
Damn, this Chris Benoit match is really good. I'm watching. I gotta watch WWE. So I'm seeing an extreme example, but it's the same time period, which is like this is something from 25. This is something from almost 20 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago. I made the joke to Mike recently. I think I'm retired from writing this is how to get into Dragon Gate piece, because I've been writing Dragon Gate content for Voices of Wrestling in July it'll be 8 years, and that is every Cork and Hall show with, a few here and there that because of my schedule, Mike has had to fill in and do the review for. That's every Big Five pay-per-view, and, a bunch of auxiliary shows, and then columns and opinions sprinkled in there. I've been doing it for 8 years, and throughout so many eras, so many different ways to watch the product on various streaming services and links and websites that videos are hosted on, through different eras of the company, through different units that the company has brought on. The roster has changed. I've done so many this is how to watch Dragon Gate articles, and I don't have it in me anymore to do that.
Yeah, and like the whole like Dragon Gate guys not getting booked on the indies, that kind of speaks to where we're at with the indies as well.
Look, I watched MLJ, who I believe I referred to him as a quote dud of a human when I reviewed some Dragon Gate GCW matches, but I watched Shun Skywalker come into GCW, and they knew nothing about him. They didn't know what his signature moves were called. They called moves that were other moves the wrong name. It was a waste of time. It was a waste of time for them to come to America.
He's there laughing in the ring. Like,
exactly. It was a hacky Luke Skywalker joke mixed in, I'm sure. And Dragon Gate last year was really serious about coming to America and regaining some sort of presence in North America. But
the indies are so different than they were when they came.
And I think they found that out. I mean, they had serious expansion plans to really make it seemingly
they got all the guys visas. Like that didn't
they got all the guys visas with the exception of Takuma Fujiwara, who debuted at the end of 2021 and was so good that 6 months later they were like, shit, this guy has to go on excursion so we can eventually bring him back and push him. He's the only one that didn't get one.
That's not something you do super like quickly and easily as many wrestlers know. Like that takes like dedication. So they had plans, and it's just it's the state of the indie wrestling. Like I remember the Velocities. Great tag team from Australia. They had a couple of really memorable matches with Aussie Open, and they were in Los Angeles this year for WrestleMania weekend, and like they had very sparse bookings, and I think they were on like one or two shows, and I think one of them said something about like, yeah, we were around, no one wanted to book us, and it's like, think about all the crappy people that were booked on various like WrestleMania weekend shows, and you had like this awesome team from Australia that could have been a highlight on any show you put out there, and instead they were just doing nothing because I don't know, the promoters aren't plugged in. They can only work with the same people that are happy to work for a hot dog and a handshake. It goes to show that it is a different era of indie wrestling, and especially when it comes to international talent that maybe has a name somewhere else, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in Japan, whether that's in Australia, whether that's in Mexico. But they can come to the US, and they could be some people that could bring something new and something innovative to the US indie scene. But if the promoters aren't on top of it, or they're not interested in bringing in those talents, then they're never going to get a chance to kind of showcase that. Would Do Fixer versus Blood Generation happen on today's indie scene? Would someone book that to happen? Maybe a few promotions.
They would have to consult, somebody that would know something that's up, something that's cool. But I don't believe, we've had this conversation before. Okay, if Dragon Gate's going to make an impact in America, they have to go through GCW. It's just the unfortunate aspect of it. And nobody in GCW, the office, knows anything about Dragon Gate. So you have to rely on somebody that they trust to say, these are the 6 guys you book. And then it's a conversation of, well, wait, who are the 6 guys that you book? And, it's not meant to be in the current setting.
Yeah. I mean, they could go through AEW potentially.
Right. It'd be great.
At least Excalibur will know the moves and prepare himself.
Yeah, I mean, La Estrella, and I think it was SB Kento. Now I got to double check this real quick because I fire up the cage match. But they did one dark match last year. Yeah, it was SB Kento and La Estrella. They did a dark match against Dante Martin and Matt Sydal, and SB Kento got hurt at the end of the match, and so it never aired. So there was
sounds like an awesome match too.
Yeah, it kicks ass because Matt Sydal is still in tune with these guys. I mean, he knows what's up. He follows Dragon Gate to this day, and he has the utmost respect for all those guys. So It sounded awesome, but I guess the finish was really messy, and so it never aired.
No, that makes sense too. Well, and I know like SB Kento and Shun Skywalker were both in the bot Battle of Los Angeles earlier this year. I
And
mean,
they got good feedback, but especially SB Kento, that match with Brian Keith was a big hit with people. And Brian Keith is one of those guys that gets it. I'm almost surprised he doesn't have a contract just because he had a minuscule amount of buzz, to kind of go back to what we were talking about at the start of the show. But
he's got
PWG used to be the place where things happen, and now it is this wasteland.
Well, I think it's just I mean, I wouldn't call it a wasteland, but it's cultural relevancy. I think, I mean, really what happened was what was happening in PWG, the best of what was happening in PWG just started happening in AEW. It's the same way with the best of what was happening in Ring of Honor happened in AEW. And so PWG shows are really good, but they are not nearly as seen as tastemakers or innovators. The way that they used to be, because in large that's because AEW has taken over for them. That seems like more of a natural progression than anything.
Yeah, yes,
like,
I would agree. I mean, look, the epicenter of wrestling shouldn't be a 200-person building in Reseda, California. It's a shame that we move past that, but it's also for the best from an industry standpoint.
Yeah. All right, Case, you got anything else you want to plug? I know we've mentioned your podcast several times, but feel free to plug it again.
Yeah, I'm going to plug it one more time. Open the Voice Gate podcast. New episodes typically every Wednesday on the Voices of Wrestling podcasting network. It's me and Mike Spears, and we do a lot of historical Dragon Gate coverage. We do, obviously, week to week show reviews, big opinions, big takes. It's a very exciting time to be a Dragon Gate fan. They're a month and a half away from their biggest show of the year, and there's a lot of different directions they can go with their main event that are very exciting. It's like I said, it's a good time to hop onto the promotion. If you've always wanted to start watching Dragon Gate, now is a good time to get involved. Feel free to send me a DM if you want any help watching it. And you can follow me on Twitter @_InYourCase.
Yeah, and I really think, obviously not a ton of people follow Dragon Gate, but I do think Jay does an amazing job for his role.
Oh yeah, there's English commentary with Jay, who has been the go-to guy for everything Toriyama and Dragon Gate since like 2002. He's a guy from Buffalo. He moved to Japan. He now does English commentary with Ho Ho Loon, who you might remember from the Cruiserweight Classic. They have a genuinely very charming rapport in the commentary booth, because Ho Ho is distracted by everything and is a wacky kind of funny guy, and Jay is the driest human I've ever come in contact with, but together they are a very good wrestling announce team.
Like Ho Ho Loon is an objectively absolutely terrible color commentator, but the dynamic makes it work, and I really like him. They
are very good at what they do, even if describing what they do just does not make any sense to anybody that hasn't experienced it.
He is not Jesse Ventura. He's not Taz. He's not Bobby Heenan. He's just like he's very different, but it definitely works with Jay and Ho Ho Loon. And
it's a little bit like, so Jay is the most knowledgeable Dragon Gate person there is, and even though he and Ho Ho have been doing commentary together for 3 years now, every show is like watching Dragon Gate with the most knowledgeable guy there is, and seemingly somebody who has never seen Dragon Gate before in their entire lives, and that is their dynamic.
Yeah, and it honestly works if you're in, it really worked, especially when they were first starting out, because Loon would be like, wait, how come that guy doesn't like that guy? And Church would be like, well, that's because 2 years ago they were in the faction, they were in this faction together, and they got in a split, and okay. And it weirdly works.
It really does.
Yeah, I'll watch a Dragon Gate show, and I'll hop in the Dragon Gate channel in the VOW Discord, and I'll just fire off my casual fan parachuting in takes.
Yeah, I saw your comments on Shun Skywalker. I wasn't too thrilled with that, but that's okay.
What did I say? I can't even remember what I said about Shun. I said his outfit is bad, which is true.
I believe you compared his screaming to one of Seth freaking.
He was kind of he was kind of being like, he was freaking like when this guy was just laughing in the ring. And
I was like, hey man, I don't know what I did to you, but I don't need that in the Discord. That's not cool, man.
But it is helpful to go in and actually ask it. And there is a dedicated regular, in addition to yourself and Mike, there is a small dedicated group of regular Dragon Gate watchers that can if you answer questions, if you want to watch a show, or just hop in.
It's truly the most enthusiastic fan base there is, in the sense that it's the opposite of gatekeeping. We would love everybody to watch Dragon
just
Gate.
want to share it with everyone.
It's so good. That's what I always try to stress to people. It's so good, and they do so many things right that other wrestling companies don't. And when people get frustrated at other wrestling, I think, well, what if you just watch Dragon Gate? Because the thing you're complaining about, they are doing, and they're doing it very well.
Yeah, and it's also like it's got this. All right, there's a lot of people on the roster. There's a lot of factions. There's a lot of history that is very important to a lot of these storylines and angles and things that are going on. But it's not a particularly difficult promotion to watch.
No, it's built off of a baby face versus heel dynamic. I mean, this will be my final point, because I do have to run in a second, but they keep kayfabe alive more than any other promotion on the planet. If you follow these guys on social media, the baby faces travel in one bus, and then the sole heel unit, either they are on that bus and they are completely hidden, or my understanding is they have a different mode of transportation to get to the buildings. When you see these guys out at dinner after the shows, they are always with their unit. Jason Lee and KZ are in a unit called Natural Vibes. Those guys are at dinner together. Jason Lee and of course, I'm going to forget every Dragon Gate wrestler on the planet. Jason Lee and BB Hulk, they're in different units. They do not go to dinner together. It is everybody thinks of Dragon Gate as this like progressive, futuristic style of wrestling. They do the old school things better than anybody else.
Yeah, and it's like, and because everyone is in a faction, like you don't really necessarily need to know the allegiances of every single individual in the promotion. You can just be like, oh, that guy's wearing all gold. That must mean he's in gold class, which means he's a heel. It's like, that guy's wearing like reggae style colors. Oh, that must mean he's a Natural Vibes. That must mean he's a baby face. And
it's intuitive. It's intuitive. You will put it together just by watching the promotion.
Yeah, it doesn't really. There's obviously a rewarding aspect of it that comes from watching closely, but you don't have to enjoy it. It's kind of like the Marvel movies, to for lack of a better comparison. Like, the idea is that if you watched every single Marvel movie, there's a connectivity and stuff that's rewarded to you as a fan, but you can also have never seen any of them before and still enjoy yourself watching it.
I think that's a very, very good way of putting it.
All right. Well, I want to thank Case for being on the show. I want to thank everyone for listening. This show, of course, is available through any of your favorite podcast app of choice. Appreciate all the support we've gotten for the podcast over the last few episodes. And I look forward to talking about some of the biggest issues in wrestling moving forward. And I'll see everyone again in the future.